What if I told you that Britain's past wasn't only ruled by kings, factories and wars, but by paperwork so petty it could ruin your week? What if the stiff upper lip era was also the don't you dare do that on a Sunday era, where ordinary life was policed by forgotten rules that sound like jokes until you remember they were enforceable? And what if some of the strangest laws weren't accidents at all, but deliberate little traps designed to control labour, morality, movement and money? Historical records show a long tradition of Parliament and local authorities trying to legislate society into behaving nicely, quietly and profitably. Sometimes it was about public order, sometimes it was about protecting powerful interests, sometimes it was just panic, dressed as principle. If you like long, slow British history for sleep or background listening, tap like, subscribe and settle in. Now lower the lights, let the centuries stretch out, and let's open the drawer of British law where the truly odd rules were filed as perfectly reasonable at the time. Forgotten law. So 1. You could be punished for being a vagrant without doing anything else. There's a certain kind of law that doesn't need you to commit a specific act. It just needs you to exist in the wrong way, in the wrong place, with the wrong level of poverty. For centuries, vagrancy laws in Britain turned hardship into suspicion, treating the visibly poor as a roaming threat that needed controlling. The setup was always framed as safety. Towns feared strangers, landowners feared disorder, authorities feared the idea that people might move freely, looking for work, food, or a better parish that might actually help them. Except the reality is that vagrancy laws often functioned like a social net turned upside down. Instead of catching people, they pinned them down. If you had no fixed address, no respectable employment, and no convincing story that pleased the local magistrate, you could be arrested, whipped, imprisoned, or forcibly removed. The law wasn't only about crime, it was about visibility, about poverty becoming public. We know this from court records, parish documents, and the sheer administrative obsession with settlement, the system that tried to decide which parish owned the responsibility for a person's survival. If you were poor and mobile, you weren't seen as a worker searching for wages. You were treated as a problem that travelled. And speaking of being treated as a problem, wait until you hear what Britain decided to do about people who were simply idle. Forgotten law too. Idle and disorderly could be a legal category. Not just an insult. Calling someone lazy is one thing. Building a legal category around it is another. Britain did both. Idle and disorderly wasn't just a phrase for grumpy newspapers. It was a label used to justify punishment, surveillance, and removal. The context is important. Industrialization pulled people towards cities, rural economies changed, seasonal work collapsed and reformed, wages fluctuated, and authorities often responded with a moral theory. If someone was poor, they must be morally failing. Except poverty is not a personality trait, but the law sometimes treated it like one. Idle could mean unemployed, or casually employed, or simply not employed in a way that impressed officials. Disorderly could mean drinking, sleeping rough, making noise, or being in company deemed suspicious. The pivot is that these laws didn't require a clear victim. They didn't require theft, assault, or fraud. They required a story. A constable's opinion, a magistrate's impatience, a community's discomfort with someone who didn't fit the tidy model of respectable labour. Official records indicate that such labels fed directly into fines and imprisonment, penalties that made it even harder to escape poverty. A person could be trapped in a loop, too poor to appear respectable, too unrespectable to avoid punishment, and too punished to become stable. Meanwhile, the same system that targeted idleness often tolerated very energetic exploitation. And speaking of exploitation, let's talk about laws that tried to control what you did on the one day you might have off. Forgotten Law 3. Sunday. Observance rules could criminalize normal life. Britain's Sunday laws, often called blue laws in other contexts, weren't always a gentle suggestion to rest. In practice, they could police leisure, commerce, travel, sport, and even the simple act of enjoying yourself too loudly. The setup comes wrapped in piety. Sunday was meant to be sacred, a day for worship, reflection, and restraint. The state and church often worked in tandem to enforce a moral rhythm. 6 days of labour, 1 day of controlled devotion, except the enforcement often fell hardest on working people. If you're wealthy, you can rest elegantly. If you're poor, Sunday might be the only day you can shop, socialise, visit family, or do the errands your employer's schedule won't allow. Contemporary accounts describe prosecutions for Sunday trading and penalties for activities deemed improper, especially in periods of heightened religious and political anxiety. The law wasn't merely about keeping the Sabbath, it was also about keeping people legible, at church, in their place, not forming rowdy crowds. And that's the hidden implication. Crowds worry governments, leisure creates gatherings create talk, talk creates ideas. So Sunday restrictions weren't always about holiness, they were also about social control, limiting the public mixing that could turn into protest, union meetings, or simple solidarity. If you think that was strict, remember, the law also cared about what you wore, what you played, and how you celebrated. And speaking of celebration, some laws got extremely nervous. About Christmas, Forgotten Law 4. Christmas could be targeted as a disorderly festival. Here's the part that always surprises modern audiences. There were times when authorities treated Christmas not as a cozy tradition, but as a dangerous outbreak of noise, drinking, and social reversal. The context is that Christmas in earlier centuries wasn't just a day, it was a season. Feasts, games, visits, drinking, misrule. Work slowed, people travelled. Servants and apprentices might demand holiday freedom. Social hierarchies loosened, and that made certain leaders uneasy. Except the crackdown wasn't only about temperance, it was political. In periods of religious conflict, especially during and after the English Civil War, certain factions viewed Christmas customs as superstition, popery, or a convenient excuse for disorder. Historical records show attempts to suppress Christmas festivities and discourage the public rituals around it. The point wasn't that mince pies were inherently subversive. The point was that a public holiday gives people time, and time is power. When people are off work together, they can form opinions together. They can share grievances, they can notice patterns, they can compare wages, rents, and treatment. So restricting festive gatherings wasn't just moral policing, it was management. And speaking of management, if you weren't allowed to revel too freely, you also weren't always allowed to move too freely. That takes us to a law that treated travel like a suspicious activity. Forgotten Law 5. Parish settlement rules could force you back where you came from. Imagine being told that you don't just live somewhere, you belong somewhere. Like a misplaced piece of property. Under the settlement system tied to poor relief, your legal home could determine whether you were allowed to stay in a parish, seek work there, or receive help if you fell on hard times. The setup sounds administrative. Parishes were responsible for supporting their own poor, so they wanted to know who counted as their own. On paper, it's budgeting, except in practice, it was a mechanism to control mobility. If a parish believed you might become a financial burden, it could remove you, sometimes quickly, sometimes harshly, sending you back to a parish of settlement based on birth, apprenticeship, service, marriage, or property rules that many people barely understood. This is documented in removal orders, parish examinations, and the bureaucratic paper trails of the poor law system. People were questioned like suspects, made to account for their lives, their work history, their family ties, their marriages, because a single detail could decide where they were dumped. The consequence was a kind of internal border regime. You could be physically present in a place and still not be allowed to become part of it. And because work increasingly required movement, especially as economies change, settlement rules could trap people in areas with no jobs, simply because that's where the paperwork said they belonged. But authorities weren't done yet. Mobility wasn't the only thing policed. Even the act of asking for money could be criminalized in ways that blurred need into crime. Forgotten law. 6. Begging could be illegal, and the punishment could be deliberately humiliating. Begging laws often claim to protect the public from fraud and nuisance. The story was that real poverty should be handled privately, through parish relief, while public begging was treated as an insult to order. The setup is easy to sell. No one likes being approached for money, and authorities promised cleaner streets and less perceived threat, except the enforcement was frequently more about shame than safety. Punishments could be designed to mark people publicly, branding them as deviant, untrustworthy, and morally stained. In earlier periods, penalties could include whipping, imprisonment, or forced labour, depending on the era and local policy. Contemporary accounts and local records show that officials often drew sharp distinctions between the deserving and undeserving poor. The trouble is that those distinctions were subjective, ideological, and conveniently aligned with what employers wanted. Workers desperate enough to accept low wages and too frightened to seek support publicly. So the law didn't just reduce begging, it increased vulnerability. And vulnerability is a bargaining chip, just not for the person holding it. Meanwhile, when the law wasn't punishing people for being poor, it was sometimes punishing them for being loud, which brings us neatly to the obsession with public nuisance. Forgotten law. 7. Nuisance could mean almost anything. Authorities found inconvenient. There are laws with precise definitions, and then there are laws that function like a blank check for whoever happens to enforce them. Public nuisance has been both a real legal concept and a convenient umbrella, capable of stretching to cover an astonishing range of behaviours. The context is urban life. As towns grew, noise, smells, crowds, and commerce pressed against each other. Authorities wanted order. They wanted streets to flow, markets to behave, and public spaces to feel controlled. Except nuisance could become a way to criminalize the presence of certain people, not just certain actions. A gathering of workers outside a tavern might be treated as a nuisance. Street performers could be treated as a nuisance. Political speakers, especially the kind who attract listeners, could be treated as a nuisance. Sometimes a person's mere persistence in public space became the offence. Official records and court reports show nuisance charges used in ways that reflect local priorities. Suppressing disorder, yes, but also suppressing inconvenience to respectable commerce and property owners. And that's the pivot. Nuisance law can be a tool of class comfort. If the law defines harm as, "I don't like what I'm seeing," enforcement becomes a mirror of power. And speaking of mirrors of power, wait until you hear how the law treated the working class habit of playing games. Forgotten law. 8. You could be restricted from playing certain games because it distracted from useful skills. Britain has a long history of telling people what leisure they're allowed to have and why. One of the most revealing examples is the old suspicion that games, especially popular games, were dangerous distractions from productivity and military readiness. The setup is national anxiety. Authorities worried that men, especially young men, were spending time on sports and games instead of practicing archery or other skills considered essential for defense. Except the deeper story is about discipline. Games bring people together. They create local culture. They encourage betting, competition, and public gatherings that can feel unruly to authorities trying to control towns and workers. Historical records show restrictions and discouragements around certain games and sports in different periods, often framed as moral or practical concerns. Sometimes it was about disorder, sometimes it was about gambling, sometimes it was about the idea that leisure should be improving, not simply enjoyable. The consequence is a familiar pattern. Elites claim the right to define what good leisure looks like and then criminalize what the poor actually do. To relax, the law becomes a social tutor with a cane. If you think that was intrusive, remember that the law also cared about what you consumed, not just alcohol, though yes, definitely alcohol, but even the basic trade in food could be policed in surprisingly aggressive ways. Forgotten law. 9. Forestalling and engrossing made certain market behaviours criminal. Before modern competition law and consumer protection, Britain had an older fear, the fear of someone buying up goods before they reached market, then reselling at a higher price. Practices known as forestalling, regrating and engrossing were treated not just as sharp dealing, but as moral offences against the community. The setup is straightforward. Food prices mattered. Hunger was political. If bread became unaffordable, unrest wasn't far behind, so authorities tried to prevent manipulation of supply, except the boundary between market behaviour and crime was often drawn in ways that served stability more than fairness. These offences could be used selectively, depending on who was accused, who was protected and what tensions were brewing. This is documented in legal discussions and court actions over time. The state sometimes treated economic behaviour as a public order issue, not because it suddenly loved the poor, but because starving people are difficult to govern. The pivot is that these laws hint at a truth modern systems still struggle with. Markets are not naturally fair. They're managed by law, by enforcement, by who gets punished and who gets praised as enterprising. And speaking of enterprise, the law could be very strict about trade, apprenticeship, and who was allowed to do a job, which brings us to a rule that treated work like a controlled guild privilege. Forgotten Law 10. Some trades were policed through apprenticeship rules that could lock people out. There was a time when just start working wasn't an option. Many trades were regulated through systems of apprenticeship and local control, which could function as both training and gatekeeping. The setup is the respectable version. Apprenticeships ensured quality, protected consumers and trained young workers properly. A craft would be preserved, standards maintained. Except the system could also be used to protect insiders and exclude outsiders, especially the poor, migrants and anyone without the right. Without connections. If you weren't apprenticed in the approved way, you might be treated as an illegal practitioner, undermining the trade and subject to penalties. Historical records show that local authorities and guild-like bodies could enforce rules about who could sell what, where, and under what conditions. It wasn't simply about skill, it was about permission. The consequences shaped class mobility. If entry into a trade required years of unpaid or poorly paid labour, plus a master willing to take you on, plus often a family able to support you, then merit was never the whole story. And speaking of the story people tell themselves, laws about quality often hid laws about profit. That's why the state sometimes regulated not only who could work, but what they could make it out of, down to the smallest detail. Forgotten Law 11. Adulteration rules could turn food and drink into a legal battlefield. Food adulteration sounds modern, like a scandal in a factory, but Britain has wrestled with it for a long time, because when profits and hunger collide, some sellers get creative in ways that are bad for human bodies. The setup is simple. People complain. Beer might be watered. Bread might be bulked with inferior materials. Milk might be thinned. Consumers might get sick. Authorities would promise action, except enforcement was uneven, and the motivation wasn't always compassion. Sometimes the drive was economic stability, public order, or protecting reputable businesses from being undercut by cheats. Sometimes it was moral panic about dishonest traders, framed as a character flaw rather than a predictable outcome of desperate competition. Official records indicate periodic crackdowns and regulatory pushes, but also long stretches where adulteration remained widespread because detection was difficult and punishment inconsistent. The pivot is that pure food laws reveal a hidden truth about lawmaking. The state often acts when the problem becomes visible, scandalous, or politically inconvenient, not simply when harm exists. And speaking of harm becoming visible, Britain also had laws that treated certain kinds of public speech as dangerous contaminants, not just threats. Words. Forgotten Law 12. Seditious. Words could be punished as if they were weapons. There were long periods in British history when saying the wrong thing about the monarch, the government, religion, or authority could drag you into court. Sedition and related offences weren't quaint footnotes. They were tools for managing dissent. The setup was national security. Authorities claimed they needed to prevent rebellion, protect stability, and stop incitement. Except the line between incitement and criticism could be whatever power needed it to be. Printers, pamphleteers, speakers, and ordinary people repeating sharp jokes could find themselves treated as threats. Sometimes the charge wasn't that you planned violent, but that your words made others imagine a different future, and that was considered dangerous enough. This is documented in trials, government correspondence, and contemporary reporting that shows the state's anxiety about public opinion once literacy and print culture expanded. The law wasn't just punishing actions, it was trying to control narratives, and that's the consequence. If you criminalize criticism, you don't eliminate discontent, you just force it underground, where it ferments. If you think that was heavy-handed, remember, British law could also get strangely intimate, policing bodies, relationships, and private behaviour under the banner of public morality. And speaking of morality, the next forgotten law is a masterclass in the state trying to legislate decency with a straight face. Forgotten Law 13. Public indecency could be defined by whatever offended the wrong person. There are laws that protect people from harm, and then there are laws that protect certain people from feeling uncomfortable. Public indecency rules in Britain have often lived in that blurry space. Real concerns mixed with broad, elastic definitions that could be stretched around whoever authorities wanted to discipline. The setup was always phrased as community standards. Streets should be respectable. Public spaces should be safe for families. Morality should have a fence around it. Except indecency was never a neutral concept. It could mean nudity, yes, but it could also mean the wrong kind of clothing, the wrong kind of affection, the wrong kind of performance, or simply being poor and visible in a way that looked unseemly to someone in power. Historical records showed that such offences were often enforced unevenly, shaped by class, gender, and social prejudice. The same act could be ignored in one neighbourhood and punished in another, and the person deciding which it would be was not an impartial philosopher. It was usually a constable, a magistrate, or a local authority under pressure to clean up an area. The consequence wasn't just embarrassment. Convictions could mean fines, imprisonment, and reputational damage, especially in communities where gossip travelled faster than any written notice. And speaking of gossip travelling, Britain didn't just police indecency, it policed speech that made the powerful look ridiculous, because mockery is a quiet kind of rebellion. Forgotten Law 14. Scandalous or seditious libel could punish you for writing about power. Libel is supposed to protect individuals from false reputational harm. But Britain also developed legal ideas that treated the state itself, its institutions, leaders, even its dignity, as something that could be libelled. The setup was order. The argument went, if you publish harsh criticism of government, you risk undermining public confidence, inciting disorder, and encouraging disrespect. Except it often worked the other way. It punished truth when truth was inconvenient. Under older approaches to seditious libel, the fact that a statement was true did not necessarily protect you. Sometimes truth made it worse because it was more convincing. This is documented in legal history and famous prosecutions where printers and writers were treated as dangerous, not because they were violent, but because they were persuasive. The law was used to discipline the press, restrict political agitation, and keep debates inside the acceptable boundaries set by those already in charge. The consequence is that free expression, especially in its early modern and 19th century forms, was not a polite gift handed down by benevolent leaders. It was fought for against laws designed to keep the public quiet. Meanwhile, while the state worried about words, it also worried about gathering, and gatherings could be treated as suspicious simply because people stood together for too long with the wrong mood. Forgotten Law. 15. Unlawful assembly could turn a crowd into a crime. Britain has always had an uneasy relationship with crowds. A crowd can be a festival. A crowd can be a funeral. A crowd can be a sports match. But a crowd can also be a political force. And that's the kind that makes lawmakers reach for definitions that blur fast. The setup was prevention. Authorities claimed they needed tools to stop riots before they started, to disperse threats, to protect property and life. Except the definition of unlawful assembly could be broad enough to include protest, labour organising, and public meetings, especially when authorities decided those gatherings might disturb the peace. The key word is might. Once a law is built on prediction, enforcement becomes a matter of interpretation. Contemporary accounts and official records show moments when authorities read crowds as inherently menacing, especially crowds of workers, reformers, or people demanding rights. The law could then justify dispersal, arrests, and penalties even when violence had not occurred. The consequences were chilling. If meeting together could be framed as criminal, political organisation became riskier, and democracy grew in spite of law, not because of it. And speaking of preventing disorder, Britain also developed a special relationship with alcohol. Not just don't get drunk, more like we will regulate the entire geography of drinking. Forgotten law. 16. Licensing laws could control not only alcohol, but social life itself. Licensing isn't just bureaucracy. In many periods of British history, it was a tool of social engineering. Pubs and alehouses weren't only places to drink. They were places to talk, hire labour, share news and form bonds. The setup was safety. Authorities argued that drink led to vice, violence, neglect, and disorder, so licensing would keep things under control, except the deeper function was control of meeting spaces. A pub is a warm room, where people gather without asking permission. That is useful for unions and reformers, and that is terrifying for certain types of officials. Historical records show licensing regimes that could be tightened during periods of unrest. Magistrates could refuse or revoke licenses, not only for crime but for being ill-managed or attracting the wrong clientele. The definition of wrong could shift with politics. The consequence was that social geography, where working people could gather, could be shaped by law. Close the pub, you don't just reduce drinking, you reduce organising. If you think that was blunt, remember that Britain also had laws designed to make sure people didn't even have too much fun in the street. That brings us to the suspiciously named concept of gaming and betting. Forgotten Law 17. Betting and gaming offences could treat leisure as a moral threat. The state's relationship with gambling has always been complicated. It condemns it, regulates it, taxes it, and occasionally profits from it. But older laws could treat gaming as something close to a disease, spreading idleness, poverty, and crime. The setup was moral reform. Gambling was blamed for ruined families, lost wages, and disorderly behaviour. So laws restricted games, betting houses, and certain forms of wagering. Except enforcement often reflected class prejudice. Wealthy people could gamble in clubs with curtains and respectability. Working people gambling in public or in informal settings were more likely to be treated as a social menace. This is documented in court actions and local regulations that targeted public gaming spaces. The law wasn't only chasing harm, it was also chasing visibility. Hidden vice among elites was tolerated more easily than public vice among the poor. The consequence is a familiar one. The law teaches you not just what is allowed, but who is allowed to do it and still be considered respectable. And speaking of respectability, Britain had laws that tried to enforce good behaviour through punishment that was deliberately public, and few things were more public than being put on display. Forgotten Law 18. Public shaming punishments were built into the legal system. Stocks, pillories, public whipping. These weren't just medieval curiosities. They were deliberately designed technologies of social control, punishments that used community gaze as part of the sentence. The setup was deterrents. If people saw what happened to offenders, they would behave. Except public shaming often became public cruelty. Crowds could throw objects, jeer, attack. The punishment wasn't only what the court imposed, it was whatever the crowd decided to add. Contemporary accounts describe the pillory as an event, sometimes festive, sometimes vicious, sometimes humiliating, beyond any proportionality to the offence. And because shame attaches differently depending on class and reputation, public punishments could destroy those with the least social protection. The consequence is that the legal system didn't just punish actions, it trained communities to participate in punishment, to become extensions of authority. If you think that sounds like a previous century, remember that law has always been tempted by spectacle. Even when punishments became less physically visible, the impulse to make examples remained. And speaking of physical visibility, Britain also had laws about what you could do with your body in public spaces, including something as basic as washing or relieving yourself. Urban order was enforced down to the human level. Forgotten law. 19. Public hygiene and filth offences could criminalise poverty. In crowded towns, sanitation was a real issue. Disease spread fast. Waste disposal was inconsistent. Authorities had reason to worry about public health. The setup then sounds reasonable. Laws against filth, dumping waste, fouling streets, or relieving oneself in public. Except the reality is that many people had no private facilities. If you live in overcrowded housing, if you have no access to proper toilets, if your neighbourhood lacks infrastructure, then public filth becomes not a choice, but a consequence of conditions. Official records show that sanitation enforcement often hit hardest in poorer areas, sometimes treating residents as the cause of filth, rather than the victims of neglect. The law could punish individuals for failures of urban planning and unequal investment. The consequence is grimly circular. Poverty produces visible disorder. Visible disorder is punished. Punishment increases poverty. Meanwhile, while the state worried about streets, it also worried about bodies moving on those streets, not just vagrants, workers. And one of the most quietly brutal systems was the way employment could be enforced through law. Forgotten law. 20. Master and servant laws could turn workplace disputes into criminal matters. In modern Britain, employment disputes are generally civil matters. Contracts, tribunals, negotiations. But for a long time, certain labour disputes could be treated as criminal offences. The setup was discipline. Employers argued they needed stable labour. If workers could simply leave, refuse tasks or protest conditions, the economy would become chaotic. Except this legal framework often placed workers under a different kind of law than employers. Under master and servant approaches, workers could be prosecuted for breach of contract, absenteeism or disobedience in ways that effectively criminalized labor resistance. This is documented in legal history and court practices where workers were fined or imprisoned for actions that today would be seen as part of labor bargaining, or simply the human reality of trying to survive. The consequence is that law enforced inequality not only by allowing exploitation, but by punishing attempts to escape it. If your employer had the law behind him, your freedom to negotiate was limited. And speaking of limits, Britain also tried to control wages and prices directly at various times, treating the economy like something you could command into stability by statute. Forgotten law. 21. Wage and price controls could be written into law to force order into the market. When we imagine wage control, we tend to think of modern policy debates, but Britain has long histories of trying to regulate wages, especially for labourers, through law and local enforcement. The setup was stability. Authorities claimed they needed to prevent inflation, ensure affordability, and keep communities functioning, except wage controls often worked in one direction, capping what workers could earn rather than guaranteeing what they needed. When the state fixed wages low, it served employers and landowners. When it fixed prices, it often aimed to prevent unrest rather than ensure justice. Historical records show periodic interventions in wages and labour, regulation across centuries often tied to crises, wars, plagues, food shortages, economic shift. The state was less interested in free markets than in predictable ones. The consequence is that the economy wasn't simply natural, it was legally shaped. And when law shapes the economy, it reveals who the state thinks deserves protection. If you think that was old-fashioned, remember that even the simple act of buying and selling could be restricted by rules about time, place, and permission. Markets weren't just places, they were regulated institutions. Forgotten law. 22. Market days and trading hours could be enforced by law, not habit. It's easy to forget that the market used to be a legal privilege as much as an economic space. Towns obtained rights to hold markets and fairs. Trading could be limited to certain days, locations, and times. The setup was order and fairness. Concentrating trade in regulated markets made it easier to inspect goods, collect fees, and prevent fraud, except it also made it easier to control who could trade and who could not. If you sold outside the authorized market, you might be punished, not necessarily because you cheated, but because you bypassed the system that benefited local authorities and licensed traders. This is documented in local regulations and court actions where illegal trading meant trading in the wrong place. In some periods, these restrictions protected consumers. In other periods, they protected monopolies. The consequence is that the law could turn economic activity into a kind of ritual, permitted only at approved times, under approved supervision. And speaking of supervision, Britain has always been unusually invested in regulating public entertainment, not just for safety, but for the content of what people were watching and hearing. Forgotten Law 23. Theatre and performance could be controlled through licensing and censorship. Theatre is not only entertainment, it's commentary, it's satire, it's the public rehearsal of ideas. British authorities knew that, which is why theatre has repeatedly been policed through licensing and censorship. The setup was decency and public order. Authorities claimed performances could incite disorder, offend morals, or mock the powerful, except that mocking the powerful is one of the oldest forms of accountability available to ordinary people. When a joke lands, it spreads. When a play stings, it lingers. So theatre regulation often functioned as a shield for authority. Historical records show systems where scripts and venues could be scrutinized, restricted, or shut down. Control wasn't only about what happened in the building, it was about what might happen in the minds of the audience afterwards. The consequence is a quieter one. Cultural life becomes narrower. Artists learn to self-censor. Audiences learn that certain truths must be whispered, not spoken. If you think that's dramatic, wait until you hear about laws aimed at something even more ordinary, the simple act of making noise. Forgotten Law 24. Noise offences could criminalise street life. Cities are loud, always have been. Hawkers, carts, animals, bells, crowds, vendors. Urban sound is a sign of life. But authorities frequently tried to regulate noise as if the goal was to make the city behave like a private drawing room. The setup was peace. People needed sleep. Noise could be disruptive. Certain sounds could signal disorder. Except noise laws often targeted the poor because the poor lived and worked publicly. If you sell goods on the street, your voice is your livelihood. If you perform, noise is your product. If you celebrate, noise is your expression. Official records and local ordinances show repeated attempts to control street cries, music, gatherings, and late-night commotion. The law didn't only reduce disturbance, it reshaped who was allowed to occupy public space. The consequence is cultural flattening. The city becomes quieter for some and more precarious for others. The people who can afford private quiet get it, and the people who can't are punished for being audible. And speaking of being audible, Britain has also had a habit of making certain kinds of political speech not just controversial, but illegal. That includes speech tied to labour. Forgotten Law 25. Early anti-union restrictions could treat workers organising as a conspiracy. Today, union membership can be ordinary, but the legal road to that normality was long and bloody-minded. There were periods when workers combining to demand better wages or conditions could be treated as criminals, accused of conspiracy or unlawful combination. The setup was economic freedom of employers. Authorities argued that if workers colluded, they distorted the market, threatened productivity, and encouraged unrest. Except employers colluded constantly in informal ways, setting wage norms, refusing to hire certain agitators, using blacklists, and coordinating against strikes. The law often treated employer power as natural and worker power as suspicious. This is documented in prosecutions and political debates, where working-class organisation was framed as a threat to public order. The real fear wasn't only strikes, it was solidarity. Solidarity reduces desperation, and desperation is useful to exploiters. The consequence is that the law helped delay labour rights by treating collective bargaining as a kind of rebellion. And speaking of rebellion, Britain also had laws designed to prevent people from even owning the means to rebel by controlling weapons, not just guns in modern terms, but older categories of arms. Forgotten Law 26. Weapons restrictions could be used to control who was allowed to feel safe. Weapons laws are always framed as safety measures, and often rightly so. But historically, restrictions on arms have also been used to control marginalised groups and prevent unrest. The setup was order. Authorities wanted to prevent violence, poaching, and rebellion. Restricting arms could reduce immediate threats, except the deeper implication is about who the state trusts. Laws could be written and enforced in ways that allowed certain groups to carry or possess arms while criminalizing others. In practice, that often aligned with class. Landowners had armed gamekeepers. The poor could be punished for having tools that looked too much like weapons. Historical records show debates and enforcement patterns where arms control served both public safety and social hierarchy. Safety was real, but selective. The consequence is a familiar one. The state monopolizes force, then decides who is respectable enough to have even a small share of it. Meanwhile, while weapons were controlled, so were animals, especially animals that the wealthy wanted protected. That brings us to laws that treated hunting not as survival, but as theft from elite pleasure. Forgotten Law 27. Game laws could make survival look like poaching. Few legal areas expose class conflict more clearly than game laws. Hunting and access to wildlife were often reserved for those with land, wealth, and status. For the poor, taking game could be framed as criminal, even when it meant feeding a family. The setup was property rights. Landowners argued that animals on their land were part of their estate and that poaching threatened order. Except wild animals don't respect deeds. The idea that a rabbit is owned because it hopped across your field is, at its core, a legal fiction built to protect privilege. Contemporary accounts describe harsh punishments for poaching in certain periods, reflecting the intensity of elite anxiety about control. Enforcement could be brutal not because the act was so inherently harmful, but because it symbolized defiance, the poor refusing to starve quietly. The consequence is that law protected not only resources but status. Poaching wasn't just theft, it was an insult, and insults are often punished more harshly than harms. And speaking of insults, Britain also had laws about insulting the sacred, which brings us to blasphemy and religious control. Forgotten Law 28. Blasphemy laws could turn religious dissent into a crime against the state. Blasphemy laws sound medieval, but they've lingered in various forms across centuries. The key idea was simple. Certain religious beliefs were tied to the legitimacy of the state, and attacking them could be treated as attacking public order. The setup was social cohesion. Authorities claimed that religion underpinned morality, and undermining it would undermine everything. Except religion was also a power structure, and blasphemy laws often protected that structure from critique. Dissenters, radicals, and skeptics could be punished not because they harmed anyone physically, but because they challenged the ideological glue holding authority together. This is documented in prosecutions and legal commentary where blasphemy was treated as more than offensive speech. It was treated as a threat. The law didn't only defend faith, it defended the establishment. The consequence was intellectual narrowing. People learned to hide their doubts. Public debate became dangerous. and dangerous debate is exactly what power often wants to prevent. If you think that's about words, remember that the law also policed images and publication, especially when they were considered obscene, which again could mean whatever made authorities clutch their pearl. Forgotten law. 29. Obscenity rules could be used to control print culture and morals. Obscenity law has always been a battlefield between moral panic and artistic expression. Britain's history includes periods where authorities cracked down on publications considered harmful, indecent, or corrupting. The setup was protection, especially of the young. Officials claimed that obscene materials degraded society, encouraged vice, and threatened family life. Except obscenity definitions were notoriously flexible. What counted as obscene depended on era, class, and whose sensibilities were treated as the national standard. And because printed material can spread fast, obscenity laws also became tools to control what ideas circulated. Official records indicate that prosecutions could target not only explicit content, but material seen as socially dangerous. Radical text, sexual health information, and literature that challenged norms. The consequence is that the law didn't only restrict pornography, it could restrict knowledge. And when you restrict knowledge, you restrict autonomy, especially for those who most need information. And speaking of autonomy, let's talk about marriage and family laws that treated women's property rights like an optional extra. Forgotten law. 30. Coverture turned married women into legal shadows. This is less a single statute and more a legal doctrine that shaped lives. Coverture. Under coverture, a married woman's legal identity could be absorbed into her husband's. Property, earnings, contracts, much of it could be controlled by him. The setup was unity. The legal fiction claimed that marriage made two people one, and that one was, conveniently, the husband. Except the real-world effect was that women could be stripped of economic independence. A woman could work and still not legally control her wages. She could inherit and still see her property managed by her husband. She could have rights in theory and lack them in practice. Historical records show how coverture shaped court outcomes and everyday life, prompting reforms only after prolonged political struggle. The law treated marriage not as partnership, but as transfer of authority. The consequence is that domestic abuse, financial control, and social dependency were structurally easier to impose. If the law makes you a legal shadow, it becomes harder to escape someone who wants to keep you there. And speaking of escape, Britain also had laws about divorce that made freedom from a marriage an expensive privilege. Forgotten law. 31. Divorce could be effectively reserved for the wealthy. For long stretches of British history, divorce was not a normal legal remedy. It could be rare, socially devastating, and financially impossible for most people. The setup was morality and stability. Marriage was sacred, authorities argued, and making divorce easy would encourage irresponsibility. Except the reality was simple. The wealthy could buy legal solutions, the poor could not. When divorce required complex legal proceedings, parliamentary involvement, or significant fees, it wasn't a moral system, it was a class system. Historical records show that reforms came gradually, often framed as modernizing but resisted by those who feared loosening social control. The effect was that many people, especially women, were trapped in marriages that were abusive, neglectful, or economically ruinous. The consequence is that law defined family values in a way that protected appearances rather than people. Meanwhile, Britain also had laws controlling children and youth, often treating them less like developing humans and more like labour units that needed discipline. That brings us to child labour regulation, which began not only as protection but also as management. Forgotten Law 32. Early factory rules could protect children while still normalising exploitation. The Victorian era is infamous for child labour, but the legal story is complicated. There were laws intended to limit abuses, regulate hours, and enforce schooling requirements. The setup was reform. Campaigners exposed horrifying conditions, and Parliament responded with legislation that looked like progress, except even protective laws often assumed child labour would continue. They didn't always challenge the underlying economic model. They tried to make it less visibly monstrous. Limits were set, but children still worked long hours. Inspections existed, but enforcement could be weak. Official records indicate the gradual tightening of factory regulation over the 19th century, reflecting political battles between industrial interests and reformers. The law moved, but it moved slowly, and often only after scandal forced it. The consequence is that child welfare became a bargaining chip between profit and public outrage. The law didn't simply protect children, it negotiated how much harm society was willing to tolerate. And speaking of tolerated harm, Britain also had laws regulating housing in ways that often prioritised property owners over tenants, which brings us to the legal obsession with nuisance again, but inside domestic spaces. Forgotten law. 33. Housing and tenancy rules could leave tenants with few rights against slum conditions. In many periods, a tenant's leverage was minimal. If you complained too loudly, you could be evicted. If you endured quietly, you suffered in overcrowded, damp, unhealthy housing. The setup was property rights. Landlords owned the building, tenants rented space. The law tended to treat this as a voluntary contract between equals, except it wasn't equal. Housing scarcity, poverty, and limited alternatives meant choice was often a fiction. Tenants didn't negotiate, they accepted. Historical records show slow development of housing regulation, especially in response to public health crises, but landlords retained significant power and tenants often lacked effective remedies. The consequence was that law could protect investments more reliably than it protected lungs. Slums weren't just a failure of morals, they were profitable, and profit tends to find legal shelter. If you think that's bleak, remember the law also regulated who could be considered respectable enough to exist in certain neighbourhoods through policing of street life, lodging houses and common spaces. Forgotten law. 34. Lodging house and common inn rules could turn shelter into a policed privilege. When people imagine old British inns, they picture warm firelight, ale, and a friendly landlord who knows everyone's name. That's the romantic version. The legal version is colder. Lodging houses and inns were often treated as sites of suspicion, places where the poor, the mobile, and the desperate gathered, which meant they were regulated, inspected, and sometimes punished into compliance. The setup was safety. Authorities worried about crime, disease, prostitution, and disorder in cramped lodging houses. They argued that regulation protected the public and the residents, except the regulation could also function as a gatekeeping system. If you were poor enough to need cheap lodging, you were also more likely to be treated as a problem that needed constant supervision. Landlords could be penalised for hosting undesirable guests. Guests could be questioned, moved along, or arrested if their presence looked too much like vagrancy. Historical records show that lodging house regulation expanded alongside urban growth and was often tied to moral fears as much as public health. Shelter wasn't just a human need, it was a space where authorities practiced social sorting. The consequence is that the most vulnerable were often given shelter only under conditions of surveillance and humiliation. The law could offer help with one hand and keep a hand on your collar with the other. And speaking of collars, Britain also had legal traditions that treated certain groups as inherently suspicious, and then built entire enforcement systems around that suspicion. Which brings us to one of the law's most revealing habits, treating suspected intent like an offence. Forgotten law. 35. Suspected intent. Offences could punish people before any harm occurred. There's a particular kind of law that thrives on fear. It doesn't wait for wrongdoing. It watches for the possibility of wrongdoing and then acts as if the possibility is enough. Britain has long had versions of this, where being found in circumstances deemed suspicious could be punished. The setup was prevention. Authorities claimed they needed to stop crime before it happened. especially theft and burglary. If someone carried tools at night, loitered near buildings, or behaved strangely, the law could intervene, except behaved strangely is often code for looked poor, looked out of place, or didn't have a respectable explanation ready. Suspicion is not evenly distributed. It sticks to certain bodies and disappears from others. Official records and legal commentary show these kinds of offences evolving over time, often framed as practical policing tools, but the hidden implication is that law can become a machine that punishes risk, and risk often means people society doesn't trust. The consequence is that you can be criminalised not for what you did, but for what someone imagines you might do. And imagination, as it turns out, is an unreliable foundation for justice. Meanwhile, while the law worried about theft, it also obsessed over morality, especially female sexuality and reproduction, which were treated as public concerns rather than private lives. Forgotten Law 36. Bastardy. Laws turned single motherhood into a legal problem to be managed for centuries. Britain treated illegitimacy not just as a social stigma, but as a legal and financial issue. The state's concern was less about morality itself and more about money. If a child was born outside marriage, who would pay? The setup was parish responsibility. Under poor law systems, parishes feared the cost of supporting unmarried mothers and their children, so law developed mechanisms to identify fathers and force financial contribution, except the process often turned into coercion. Women could be interrogated, pressured, and punished. Their private lives became legal evidence. Their reputations became currency. Men could deny responsibility, vanish, or manipulate the system, while women bore the visible consequences. Historical records show bastardy examinations and affiliation orders as bureaucratic rituals that blended welfare with surveillance. The law wasn't merely helping families, it was protecting parish budgets and enforcing social conformity. The consequence is that female sexuality and pregnancy became subjects of public administration. The state inserted itself into bodies and relationships, not as a gentle guardian, but as a debt collector. And speaking of collecting, Britain also developed an elaborate love affair with taxing, licensing, and regulating everyday items. Some of the strangest laws are simply about revenue disguised as virtue. Forgotten Law 37. Tax and excise rules could turn ordinary goods into criminal contraband. There were times in British history when the law treated items like salt, soap, paper, windows, candles, and even hats as tax opportunities. When taxes were high enough, ordinary people became smugglers by necessity or temptation. The setup was war finance and state revenue. Britain needed money, especially during long conflict, and excise taxes were reliable sources, except taxes don't fall equally. When you tax essentials, you tax survival, and when you tax everyday goods heavily, you create black markets. Smuggling becomes not only profitable but widespread, especially in coastal communities. Official records indicate extensive enforcement against smuggling, including seizures, harsh penalties, and crackdowns that could turn entire regions into cat-and-mouse zones between locals and authorities. The consequence is that law becomes a battlefield between state revenue and local economies. People who see the tax as unfair don't experience themselves as criminals. They experience themselves as resisting theft. The state, of course, calls it the other way around. If you think that was tense, remember, the law also regulated time itself, not in a philosophical way, literally through curfews, night watching, and restrictions on movement after dark. Forgotten Law 38. Night walking and curfew-style rules could make being out after dark suspicious. There's a long tradition in British towns of treating nighttime as a special legal zone. Darkness meant reduced visibility, increased fear, and a belief that crime lurked in shadows. Authorities responded by regulating who could be out, why, and under what conditions. The setup was protection. Night watch systems, curfew-like expectations, and policing of night walkers were framed as public safety measures, except night walker didn't always mean criminal. It could mean someone working late, travelling, meeting friends, or simply living a life that didn't fit respectable daylight schedules. And certain groups, especially women, could be labelled suspicious simply for being outside at night. Contemporary accounts describe moral assumptions layered onto these rules, especially regarding prostitution and improper behaviour. Night became not just a time of danger, but a time of judgment. The consequence is that public space effectively shrank after sunset for those without protection or status. The wealthy moved in carriages or stayed indoors. The poor walked and risked suspicion. And speaking of suspicion, Britain also had laws about clothing and appearance that functioned like social sorting, because if you can identify someone by what they wear, you can control who belongs where. Forgotten law. 39. Clothing and disguise laws could criminalise masks, costumes, and even working-class dress. Disguise laws weren't always about bank robbers in masks. In some contexts, they were about protests, people hiding identity to avoid retaliation. In others, they were about class boundaries, preventing certain people from dressing above their station or using costume to blur social lines. The setup was security. Authorities argued that disguises facilitated crime and made it harder to hold people accountable, except disguise also facilitated political survival. If you protest against power and power knows your name, your job and your home become vulnerable. Masking can be a defense, not an offense. Historical records show periods when disguise and mask wearing were treated with suspicion, especially around riots and unrest. The law wasn't only preventing theft, it was preventing anonymity, because anonymity protects dissent. The consequence is chilling. If identity must always be visible, fear becomes a tool of governance. People hesitate to speak or gather because they know they can be singled out later. Meanwhile, the law didn't just police what you wore. It policed what you built and where you built it, often through rules that controlled urban development in surprisingly strict ways. Forgotten law. 40. Building and fire regulations could be life-saving and also punitive. Some forgotten laws began as genuine responses to disaster. Fire regulations, building codes, and urban planning rules often tightened after catastrophic events, especially fires that tore through dense wooden housing. The setup was survival. After major fires, authorities sought to reduce risk by regulating materials, street widths, and construction practices, except enforcement could also become punitive, particularly toward poorer builders and residents who couldn't afford compliance. Regulations might demand expensive materials or alterations, pushing costs onto those least able to pay. Official records indicate that urban regulation frequently balanced safety with economic interests. Wealthy areas could adapt more easily. Poorer areas could be targeted for demolition, displacement, or strict enforcement that effectively cleared populations. The consequence is that even sensible laws can act like class filters. Safety becomes a reason to reshape cities in ways that protect property values and remove inconvenient populations. And speaking of property values, Britain also had laws that treated public space like a controlled asset. Streets, pavements, commons, policing who could use them and how. Forgotten law. 41. Commons and public space rules could criminalise traditional rights. Common land and public rights, grazing, gathering wood, walking paths, were once essential to rural survival. People relied on commons for fuel, food, and small-scale support. The setup for restricting these rights was improvement. Landowners argued that enclosing commons would increase productivity, modernise agriculture, and benefit the nation. Except enclosure often meant dispossession. When commons were enclosed, people lost access to resources that had cushioned poverty. Traditional rights became trespass. Survival behaviours became crimes. Historical records show enclosure processes formalised through legal mechanisms, transforming landscapes and livelihoods. The law made it official. What had been communal became private. The consequence is one of the great quiet revolutions of British history. Law didn't just reflect property, it created it in new forms and it created poverty alongside it. If you think that's the end of the legal oddities, remember, the law also cared about the tiny mechanics of daily life, like where you could empty waste, how you could transport goods, and how you could move animals through towns. Forgotten law. 42. Animal and cart regulations could turn basic transport into a legal trap. In towns and cities full of carts, horses, livestock, and pedestrians, rules developed about traffic flow and animal control. Some of these were practical, some were petty, some were both. The setup was safety and cleanliness. Animals could cause accidents, block roads, and leave mess. Carts could damage infrastructure and endanger pedestrians. Except enforcement could become another tool for extracting fines and controlling working-class livelihoods. If your job depended on moving goods, any technical violation could cost you money you didn't have. If your animals were your assets, penalties could cripple you. Official records show local ordinances regulating movement through streets, times for transport, and behaviour of drivers and drovers. The law became a daily obstacle course, especially for those whose work happened outdoors and publicly. The consequence is that order often meant friction for the poor. The people most exposed to public rules were those who lived in public: vendors, labourers, drovers, hawkers. And speaking of vendors, Britain also had legal obsessions with measurement, weights, measures, and the literal size of things, because if you control measurement, you control trade. Forgotten law. 43. Weights and measures. Laws could criminalise the wrong scoop or short-yard standardised measurement. Sounds boring until you realise it's a fight over trust and money. Britain developed extensive regulations on weights and measures to prevent cheating, ensure fair trade, and stabilise markets. The setup was consumer protection. If merchants used false weights, people would be robbed quietly, one transaction at a time. Except enforcement could also be political. Inspectors could target certain traders. Markets could become arenas where the law favoured established merchants over informal sellers. And in times of scarcity, measurement enforcement could become a tool to control panic. Historical records show how governments treated measurement as a cornerstone of economic order. The law didn't just punish cheating, it defined what fair looked like in physical terms. The consequence is that the law inserted itself into the most basic act of exchange: the size of a loaf, the weight of grain, the length of cloth. Control the standard, and you control the economy's heartbeat. Meanwhile, Britain also regulated paper. Literally, taxes and rules around printed material could shape who had access to information and who could afford to publish. Forgotten law. 44. Stamp and paper regulations could make information a privilege. Taxes on newspapers and printed material weren't just revenue tools, they could operate as barriers to literacy culture for ordinary people. If reading the news costs extra, the public stays less informed. The setup was fiscal necessity. Governments needed money and printed material was an easy target. Except taxing information has political side effects, and sometimes those side effects are convenient for those in power. If newspapers are expensive, fewer working people read them. If pamphlets are taxed or restricted, fewer radical ideas circulate. Official records indicate that debates over such taxes were tied to questions of press freedom and political access. Reformers often fought these barriers precisely because they understood that information is power. The consequence is that law can control public consciousness indirectly by making knowledge costly. And speaking of cost, Britain also criminalised certain kinds of debt and financial failure in ways that treated misfortune as moral collapse. Forgotten law. 45. Debtors could be imprisoned, turning poverty into a cage. Debtor's prison is one of those phrases that sounds like a Dickens stereotype until you realise it was a functional legal reality for a long time. People who could not pay debts could be imprisoned, sometimes for extended periods. The setup was accountability. Credit relied on trust, and the law protected creditors by punishing non-payment, except imprisoning someone for debt often made repayment less likely. If you remove someone from work, you remove their income. The system could become less about recovering money and more about punishment and social control. Historical records and contemporary accounts describe debtor imprisonment as widespread enough to be a recognizable part of life. It didn't only punish reckless spending, it punished illness, economic downturns, failed harvests, and all the ordinary disasters that can collapse a household. The consequence is that the legal system treated financial failure as personal failure, an outlook that conveniently protected wealthier interests. If you think that was harsh, remember, Britain also had laws that policed poverty through the workhouse system, where relief could come with conditions designed to deter anyone from seeking it. Forgotten law. There are 46 workhouse rules made help deliberately unpleasant. Workhouses were built on a philosophy: relief should be less desirable than even the lowest paid labour. That way only the truly desperate would seek it. That was the moral logic. The legal framework supported it. The setup was discouragement. Authorities wanted to prevent dependency and reduce costs, except the result was institutional cruelty. Families could be separated. Conditions could be harsh by design. Diets could be minimal. Work could be monotonous and degrading. An entry into the workhouse could come with loss of autonomy and dignity. This is documented in official reports, parliamentary debates, and contemporary criticism that exposed the human cost. The workhouse wasn't simply an aid program, it was a warning: be poor quietly or suffer publicly. The consequence is that poverty was managed through fear. Relief became a tool of discipline, not compassion. And speaking of discipline, Britain also had a habit of regulating children not only through labour laws, but through juvenile justice frameworks that could be startlingly severe. Forgotten Law 47. Children could be treated like miniature adult criminals. In earlier legal periods, children could be prosecuted and punished with a severity that shocks modern sensibilities. Age protections existed inconsistently, and childhood was not always treated as a protected developmental stage. The setup was deterrents. Authorities wanted to prevent theft and disorder, and they treated young offenders as examples to others. Except childhood poverty often drove petty crime. A child stealing food isn't a hardened criminal. They are a hungry child in a system that has failed them. But the law could interpret survival as moral deviance. Historical records show harsh sentencing practices and crowded prisons where juveniles could be mixed with adults, with predictable consequences. The consequence is that law didn't just punish crime, it produced it. If you treat a child like a criminal, you narrow their future until criminality becomes the path left open. If you think that's grim, remember, Britain also criminalised certain kinds of sexual behaviour in ways that were less about harm and more about enforcing social norms, often brutally. Forgotten. Law 48. Sexuality could be policed through laws that targeted identity, not harm. British legal history includes offences that criminalise sexual acts between consenting adults, reflecting religious and moral frameworks rather than harm-based logic. The setup was morality, tradition, and public decency, except criminalising consenting relationships isn't about protecting victims. It's about enforcing conformity. Such laws created fear, secrecy, blackmail, and vulnerability to abuse, because when your existence is illegal, anyone can threaten you with exposure. This is documented in legal history through prosecutions and social consequences that shaped lives quietly and disastrously. The law didn't simply punish acts, it punished identities and intimacy. The consequence was a culture of silence and fear, an atmosphere where people could be destroyed by accusation alone. And speaking of accusation, Britain also had laws that treated witchcraft and superstition not only as spiritual error, but as legal offence, with deadly seriousness in some eras. Forgotten Law 49. Witchcraft and magic could be a legal category with real punishments. There were periods when Britain treated witchcraft as a prosecutable offence, tied to religious belief and fear of invisible harm. Accusations could spiral into trials, community hysteria, and severe penalties. The setup was protection. Authorities claimed they were safeguarding communities from malevolent forces, except witchcraft accusations often functioned as social weapons. They targeted outsiders, vulnerable women, the elderly, the poor, and anyone who didn't fit community expectations. Fear became a justification for punishment when evidence was vague and superstition did the heavy lifting. Contemporary accounts and historical records show the role of local tensions, religious fervour, and political context in fueling witchcraft prosecutions. The consequence is a reminder that law is only as rational as the society writing it. When belief becomes enforcement, reality is optional, and scapegoats become inevitable. And finally, to close our list of forgotten British laws, we come to something that looks mundane but reveals a lot: the state's habit of trying to regulate morality through tiny everyday behaviours, because control is often easiest in small doses. Forgotten law. 50. Moral order could be enforced through small, everyday prohibitions. One of the most revealing patterns in British legal history is how often power expresses itself through tiny prohibitions. Not only grand treason laws and dramatic punishments, but small rules that shape daily life. What you can sell, when you can gather, how you can behave in public, what counts as respectable, who is permitted to be visible. The setup is always the same: order, decency, tradition, safety. The language is soothing. It claims to protect. Except the cumulative effect is control. A society governed by countless small restrictions teaches people to police themselves. It teaches them to shrink their behaviour to fit what authority finds comfortable. And it teaches them to accept that the law can reach into everything. Historical records show how such rules accumulate over time, some repealed, some evolving, some lingering in modern forms. The point isn't that Britain was uniquely odd. It's that Britain was meticulous. It built systems of control that could operate quietly, bureaucratically, and relentlessly, without needing constant drama. The consequence is a kind of cultural training. People learn that certain lives are normal and certain lives are suspicious. And once suspicion becomes legal, it becomes everyday. So here we are at the bottom of the drawer, 50 laws and legal habits that once felt normal enough to enforce. Some were born from real problems: fire, fraud, disease, violence. Others were born from fear: fear of crowds, fear of poverty, fear of dissent, fear of pleasure, fear of anyone living outside the approved script. And the most unsettling truth is that many of these laws weren't mistakes. They were solutions, just not solutions for everyone. Because law is rarely only about behaviour. It's about the kind of society power wants to produce. Vagrancy rules didn't simply punish crime, they punished instability. Settlement rules didn't simply manage welfare, they managed movement. Sunday restrictions didn't simply honour religion, they managed time. Master and servant frameworks didn't simply regulate contracts, they managed obedience. And all the way through, you can see the same quiet logic. If you can make ordinary life conditional on respectability, permission, paperwork, then you can make people easier to govern. If you listened closely, you may have noticed another pattern too: the law's relationship with visibility. Many of these rules didn't chase hidden harm, they chased public discomfort. They targeted what could be seen: begging, noise, gatherings, street trade, indecency, poverty that refused to stay private. And that's a warning from the past that still matters. When law is driven by what bothers the comfortable, it often punishes the vulnerable. But there's also something oddly hopeful in this list. Not because these laws were kind. They often weren't. The hopeful part is that many of them changed. People argued. People resisted. Reformers documented abuses. Communities pushed back. Sometimes the law moved because it had to, because the old rules became indefensible in public view. And that means the legal world we inherit is not fixed. It's negotiated. By pressure, by protest, by persistence, by ordinary people refusing to accept that that's just how it is. If you want more long, slow British history like this, more forgotten rules, hidden systems, and the strange logic behind them, tap like, subscribe, and let the next story begin when you're ready. For now, take a breath, let the centuries fade back into the dark, and remember, the past wasn't only lived, it was enforced,